In the heart of West Central Africa, where the Kwanza River cuts through ancient kingdoms and the Atlantic winds whisper tales of resistance, there lived a queen who would become Europe's greatest nightmare. Her name was Nzinga. Pause for a moment. Let that name settle. Nzinga. In the language of her people, it meant twisted or wrapped, a reference to the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck at birth. The elders said it was an omen, a sign that this child would survive what others could not, that she would choke the life out of her enemies. They had no idea how right they were. While European monarchs sat on golden thrones in perfumed halls debating etiquette and inheritance, Nzinga commanded armies from horseback, her sword stained with the blood of invaders. While they sent ambassadors with flowery speeches, she negotiated with a dagger hidden in her robes and a mind sharper than any blade. When a Portuguese governor tried to humiliate her, she turned his insult into legend. Sitting on the back of her own servant, a living throne, to prove she would bow to no one. For 40 years she defied the mightiest empire of her age. She outwitted their generals, manipulated their diplomats, and transformed herself from a princess into a warrior king. Yes, king, not queen, because in a world that denied power to women, she simply refused to be a woman by their rules. This is the story of Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, the woman who dressed as a man to rule an empire, the queen who became a legend, the African leader who humiliated Portugal and changed the course of history. And the reason you've never heard her name? Because her story was too dangerous to tell. Until now. The year was 1583, in the kingdom of Ndongo, in what is now Angola, on the southwestern coast of Africa. Imagine a land of impossible beauty, granite hills rising from red earth, rivers flowing silver through valleys untouched by time, markets filled with the scent of spices and the sound of drums, a civilization that had stood for centuries, governed by kings who traced their lineage to the gods themselves. The land was rich beyond imagination. Gold flowed from the mines like water. Ivory filled the storehouses. Iron ore was so abundant that Ndongo's blacksmiths forged weapons that could cut through Portuguese steel. The kingdom traded with merchants from across Africa, from the Sahara to the Indian Ocean coast. But there was one resource the Europeans wanted above all others. Not gold, not ivory, not iron. People. Human beings who could be captured, chained, branded like cattle, and sold across the Atlantic to work themselves to death in the plantations of Brazil and the Caribbean. The Portuguese called it commerce. History would call it the slave trade. Nzinga would call it what it was: genocide. The Portuguese had arrived decades earlier, in the late 1400s. At first, they came as traders. They smiled. They offered guns and mirrors and cloth. They spoke of partnership, of mutual benefit, of God's love. But their true intentions soon became clear. They built fortresses along the coast, massive stone structures bristling with cannons, designed not for defense, but for domination. They armed rival kingdoms, turning neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. They demanded tribute, gold, ivory, and slaves, thousands of slaves. And when the kingdoms refused, the Portuguese unleashed war. Ndongo's king Kiluanji resisted. He fortified his borders. He mobilized his armies. He sent emissaries to negotiate. But the Portuguese were relentless. Their muskets roared like thunder. Their cannons shattered stone walls that had stood for generations. Their hunger for slaves was insatiable, a bottomless pit that swallowed entire villages. Into this world of fire and blood, in the year 1583, a daughter was born to the royal family. Her name was Nzinga Mbande. She was not the firstborn. She was not male. By the customs of her people, she had no claim to power. But from the moment she took her first breath, with the umbilical cord wrapped around her throat, it was clear she was different. While other princesses learned to weave and sing, Nzinga trained with the warriors. She demanded to be taught how to throw a spear, how to wield a sword, how to ride a horse into battle. Her father, King Kilwanji, indulged her. Perhaps he saw something in her eyes. A fire, a hunger, a refusal to accept the world as it was. She learned languages, Portuguese, Dutch, the dialects of neighboring kingdoms. She listened when the elders debated strategy. She studied the Europeans, not with fear, but with cold calculation. She learned their religion, their politics, their weaknesses, and she watched as her kingdom bled. Every year, more villages burned. Every year, more people vanished into the holds of slave ships. Every year, the Portuguese tightened their grip on the coast, choking Ndongo's trade routes, isolating the kingdom from the world. Nzinga was not powerless, but she was patient, and she was learning. She was learning how empires fall and how queens rise. By 1622, Ndongo was on its knees. King Kiluanji was dead. Nzinga's brother, Ngola Mbandi, now wore the crown, but he was a weak ruler, paranoid, cruel, easily manipulated. The Portuguese controlled the entire coastline. Slave raids devastated the interior. Famine spread like plague. Refugees flooded the capital, starving, desperate, begging for protection that the king could not provide. The Portuguese governor in Luanda, João Correia de Sousa, sent a message to the royal court. Come to Luanda and negotiate a peace treaty, or we will march our armies inland and burn Ndongo to ash. It was not an invitation, it was a threat. But King Ngola Mbandi could not go himself. To kneel before the Portuguese governor would be to admit defeat. It would destroy what little authority he had left. His own people would turn on him. The kingdom would collapse from within. So he made a decision. He would send someone else, someone intelligent, someone fearless, someone who could negotiate with the Portuguese without surrendering Ndongo's dignity. He sent his sister, Nzinga. The journey to Luanda took weeks. Nzinga traveled with a small retinue of advisors and warriors through lands scarred by war, burned villages, abandoned fields, the skeletons of the dead left unburied. This was what Portuguese civilization looked like. When she arrived at the fortress of Luanda, the Portuguese were waiting. The meeting took place in the governor's audience hall, a grand room designed to intimidate. High ceilings, tapestries depicting European conquests, armed soldiers lining the walls, and at the far end, seated on an ornate chair elevated on a platform, Governor João Correia de Sousa himself. He sat like a king, like a god, and before him on the floor was nothing but a woven mat. A mat for an African to sit on. Beneath him, below him, like a subject, like a slave. The insult was intentional. The governor wanted Nzinga to kneel, to sit on the ground while he loomed above her, to accept symbolically that Portugal was superior and Ndongo was inferior. Nzinga understood the game immediately. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her eyes sweeping the room. The soldiers tensed. The governor smirked. He thought he had won before the negotiation even began. And then Nzinga moved. Without a word, without hesitation, she gestured to one of her attendants, a woman who had traveled with her from Ndongo. The woman knelt on all fours in the center of the room, and Nzinga sat on her back, a living throne. The room went silent. The Portuguese soldiers stared. The governor's smirk vanished. Nzinga sat calmly, her posture regal, her gaze level with the governor's. She had matched his height. She had refused to be beneath him. And she had done it without saying a single word. The message was clear. I am not your inferior. I am a queen, and I will not kneel. The negotiations began. Nzinga spoke fluent Portuguese, better in fact than some of the governor's own advisors. She quoted European treaties. She cited legal precedents. She exposed every broken promise Portugal had made over the past 50 years. She demanded the immediate withdrawal of Portuguese forces from Ndongo's territory. She demanded the return of thousands of captured people. She demanded recognition of her brother's sovereignty. The governor tried to intimidate her. He raised his voice. He pounded the table. He threatened war. Nzinga never flinched. She reminded him that Portugal's resources were stretched thin, that their wars in Brazil and India were bleeding them dry, that Ndongo had allies, the Dutch, who were more than happy to arm Portugal's enemies. She offered trade agreements, access to resources, a peaceful partnership, but only if Portugal respected Ndongo's independence. Hours passed, the sun set, candles were lit, and slowly, impossibly, Nzinga began to win concessions. Not because Portugal respected her, but because she had out-negotiated them. And then she did something extraordinary. To seal the treaty, she agreed to be baptized as a Christian. She knelt before a Portuguese priest and accepted the name Dona Ana de Sousa. The Portuguese celebrated. They thought they had converted a pagan queen. They thought they had won her soul. But Nzinga knew better. She had studied the Europeans long enough to understand their weakness. They believed their own religion made them superior. By converting, she gained their respect, at least temporarily. She could negotiate as a Christian queen rather than a pagan savage. It was a masterful political move, and it bought her time. But Nzinga never forgot who she was. And she never forgot what the Portuguese had done to her people. The treaty was signed. Nzinga returned to Ndongo, and the Portuguese, confident they had tamed the African queen, went back to their slave raids. They had no idea what was coming. 2 years later, in 1624, King Ngola Mbandi died. The official cause of death was illness. But whispers spread through the kingdom. Poison, some said. Assassination, others claimed. A few even suggested that Nzinga herself had orchestrated his death. The truth, we may never know. What we do know is this: within days of her brother's death, Nzinga seized the throne. But there was a problem. A massive, seemingly insurmountable problem. In Ndongo, women were not allowed to rule. The throne passed from father to son, from king to king. Women could advise, they could influence. But they could not wear the crown. Nzinga's solution was as brilliant as it was audacious. She declared herself king, not queen. King. She cut her hair short. She dressed in men's clothing, warrior's armor, leather and iron, a sword at her hip. She walked like a man, talked like a man, commanded like a man. She surrounded herself with a harem of young men dressed as women, a deliberate reversal of gender norms that shocked Portuguese observers and confused her enemies. Was it theater? Absolutely. Was it madness? Not at all. It was strategy. By becoming a king, Nzinga could lead armies into battle. She could negotiate with male rulers as an equal. She could claim legitimacy in a patriarchal world that would have dismissed a queen as weak or illegitimate. And it worked. Her warriors accepted her. Her people rallied behind her. And the Portuguese, who had thought they could manipulate a weak woman, suddenly found themselves facing a tactical genius. But Portugal did not honor the treaty. Of course they didn't. Within months, Portuguese forces invaded Ndongo again. They installed a puppet king, a distant cousin of Nzinga's whom they could control. They declared Nzinga illegitimate. They sent armies to hunt her down, to capture her, to break her. So Nzinga did what any great leader would do. She adapted. She fled east with her most loyal warriors. She crossed into the neighboring kingdom of Matamba, a smaller but strategically important territory. And she conquered it, not through diplomacy, not through marriage, through war. Matamba's ruler resisted. Nzinga crushed him. She seized the throne, fortified the borders, and transformed Matamba into a fortress of resistance, a sanctuary for runaway slaves, a base of operations for guerrilla war. For the next 30 years, Queen Nzinga waged unrelenting war against the Portuguese Empire, and she became a legend. Nzinga was not just a queen. She was a military genius. She studied Portuguese tactics and adapted them. When the Europeans used cavalry, she trained her own horsemen. When they built fortified positions, she developed guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes in the jungle, raids on supply lines. She formed alliances with the Dutch, who were rivals of Portugal and eager to weaken their enemies' grip on Africa. Dutch ships brought guns, cannons, and ammunition. In return, Nzinga granted them trading rights. She sheltered thousands of runaway slaves, men and women who had escaped Portuguese plantations and slave ships. She didn't just free them, she armed them, trained them, turned them into soldiers. These former slaves became some of her most loyal and effective warriors, fighting not just for a kingdom but for their own freedom. She raided Portuguese forts, cutting off their supply lines. She sabotaged their trade routes. She ambushed their patrols. The Portuguese sent army after army to capture her. Every time she vanished into the wilderness, striking from the shadows, always one step ahead. They sent assassins. She survived every attempt. They offered bribes to her advisors. She executed the traitors publicly. They tried to starve her kingdom into submission. She opened new trade routes through the interior. In 1644, at the age of 62, an age when most rulers were preparing their tombs, Nzinga personally led her warriors into battle. European chroniclers who witnessed it could barely believe their eyes. An elderly African woman, charging into combat on horseback, sword raised, commanding thousands of warriors, refusing to surrender. She negotiated when it suited her. She made alliances when they were advantageous. She played European powers against each other, pitting the Dutch against the Portuguese, the Spanish against the Dutch, always keeping her enemies divided and distracted. But Nzinga was more than a warrior. She was a state builder. In Matamba, she created something extraordinary, a multi-ethnic, multicultural kingdom. She welcomed refugees from across the region, people fleeing Portuguese slavery, survivors of destroyed villages, warriors from defeated kingdoms. She gave them land, she gave them protection, she gave them hope. She established independent trade networks, bypassing Portuguese control. She preserved her people's culture, their music, their stories, their traditions, while adapting to survive in a world dominated by European guns and greed. Her kingdom became a symbol, proof that Africans were not helpless victims, proof that resistance was possible, proof that empires could be defied, and Portugal could not break her. In 1656, at the age of 74, Queen Nzinga finally made peace with Portugal. Not because she had been defeated, not because she had grown weak, but because she had won. Her kingdom was secure, her people were free. The Portuguese, exhausted after decades of war, could no longer afford to fight her. They had lost thousands of soldiers, they had spent fortunes, and they had failed to conquer Matamba. So they signed a treaty, a real treaty this time, one that recognized Nzinga's sovereignty, one that allowed her to rule in peace. She had outlasted them. Nzinga ruled Matamba for 7 more years. She rebuilt villages. She expanded trade. She became a patron of the arts, sponsoring musicians and storytellers who preserved the history of her people. In 1663, at the age of 81, Queen Nzinga Mbande died peacefully in her sleep. Even the Portuguese, who had tried for 40 years to destroy her, praised her as a great leader. One Portuguese chronicler wrote, "She was a woman of extraordinary intelligence, courage, and determination. A worthy adversary." But here's the tragedy. For the next 300 years, her story was erased. European historians ignored her. Colonial textbooks dismissed her as a tribal warlord or a savage. Her name was deliberately buried, her achievements forgotten, her legacy reduced to footnotes. Why? Because her story was dangerous. A powerful African woman who defeated European armies did not fit the colonial narrative. It contradicted the lie that Africans were inferior, that they needed to be civilized by Europeans, that colonization was justified. So they erased her. But they couldn't erase her completely. In Angola, the memory of Queen Nzinga survived, passed down through generations, whispered in songs and stories, a symbol of resistance that colonizers could not destroy. And today, finally, the world is remembering. Queen Nzinga was not perfect. She was ruthless when she needed to be. She made alliances with slavers when it suited her strategy. She sacrificed much to survive, but she was extraordinary. In an age when women were denied power, she became a king. In an era when Africa was being carved up by European empires, she held her ground for 40 years. She proved that Africans were not victims waiting to be saved. They were warriors, diplomats, strategists who could challenge the mightiest powers on earth. Her story was buried because it was too dangerous to tell. But history remembers. Statues of Queen Nzinga now stand in Angola. Schools bear her name. Her face appears on currency. And across Africa and beyond, her legacy inspires those who refuse to be conquered. The warrior queen who defied Europe. The woman who became a king. The legend who will never die. Her name was Nzinga, and now you know her story.